Welcome to State of the State, a program sponsored by Operation Clean Government of Rhode Island. I'm Keith Tebow. On today's program, we're going to talk about property taxes here in Rhode Island, a very popular or sometimes not so popular topic for many of us who live in the Ocean State. We're going to talk a little bit about how the property tax is set up here in Rhode Island, and also a plan to reform property taxes here in the Ocean State. We have two guests with us today. To my far right is Dr. Harvey Waxman. He is the founder of RIGHT, which is the Rhode Island Gets Honorable Taxes organization. And to Dr. Waxman's left is Representative John Laughlin, a Republican from District 71, servicing the communities of Little Compton, Portsmouth, and Tiverton. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for
having me. I apologize for the mess up on the organization's name.
I've been treated worse. Thank you very much.
Dr. Waxman, let me start with you. Property taxes in Rhode Island, why do we have them and how did they start?
Well, why do we have them? We have them because taxes pay for our government. We need to pay for the government and services that we have. Whether that's local taxes, state taxes, or federal taxes, we have to pay. The property tax has an ancient history. There was recently an article I read in the newspaper that the oldest evidence of the ad valorem property tax was discovered on a tablet dating from 7000 BC. That's an old tax. Mm-hmm. In the earliest days of our civilization, as you know, we were essentially farmers, everybody. Everything came from the land. Sure. We were an agricultural society, and when we had to fund local services, even in those days, the only way we could raise money was to tax something. Now, we didn't keep track of income. There were no banks to monitor how much money we earned, so we taxed the easiest thing, and that was property. You couldn't hide it. The income it produced was easily known. Everyone knew how many bushels of wheat you got from an acre of land. So the property tax, since it was taxing the value of the income that property produced, was really more like an income tax, mm-hmm. which of course changed with the Industrial Revolution, which began right here in Pawtucket. Slater's Mill opened on the Blackstone River in 1793, and since then, we don't live on farms anymore. We work in factories and perform services and earn money. And with that money, we buy homes. And now a marketplace develops, and homes are bought and sold. Not like it was when we had the original property tax. Mm-hmm. And this marketplace determines the value of our property today. Mm-hmm. So we are using a system that is thousands and thousands of years old in exactly the same way, but everything is different, and we have not changed at all. We still use the property tax. Mm-hmm. And this is what needs to be changed because of the pain that people suffer every 3 years now that we have to revalue.
As you say, every 3 years in Rhode Island, property taxes are revalued. Traditionally, what is the process of the revaluation, and in your research, how has that impacted property taxes?
Well, anyone who's gone through a revaluation knows how awful it feels until you find out what your tax bill is going to be. But there is a need for revaluation. And if we didn't revalue, it would mean that if someone were to buy a piece of property that went up in value and was paying $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for a piece of property, they could be paying taxes on the original value of the property, which wouldn't seem fair.
Right.
The original owner may have bought it at $100,000, and now someone gives him $500,000. He should pay more. I think we all would agree. So we revalue so that the new owners, the new buyers, can pay their fair share. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we don't just revalue the property that the new owners buy. We revalue his neighbor, too. Mm-hmm. And this is when the pain starts.
Mm-hmm. For people who may have been in their house for decades in some respects.
And merely
they didn't pay $500,000 for that home 30 years ago.
Nor could they afford to today. Correct. And yet they are forced to pay a tax as if they were prepared and able to pay the same thing as the new neighbor paid. So on one hand, we have two identical homes, but we have two very different people. And this is where the inequity and unfairness comes.
Obviously, you've done a lot of research on revaluation and the burden, if you will, and how one segment of property taxpayers tend to pay more than others. On your website, which is righttax.org,
Yes.
there's a detailed explanation, a video that's attached, and you mentioned the town of North Kingstown in particular. Give us a brief example of what happened in North Kingstown, how values tended to skew a certain way. Some people received very high tax bills under the revaluation, while others saw a decrease.
Right. I don't want to pick on North Kingstown. I
Sure.
love living.
Just an example.
I love living in North Kingstown. And the problem with North Kingstown is the same in every city, because it is the same set of rules that we use, and in fact, it's the same set of rules in every state. This is just the way we've been doing it for hundreds, thousands of years. But in North Kingstown, for example, the last revaluation was done when the tax levy rose a very modest 3.8%. The town council has placed a limit on the amount of the tax levy, which is a little bit tougher than the state limit. As you know, it's 5.5%.
Right.
North Kingstown limited its tax levy increase to 3.8%. However, there was a revaluation. Now, revaluation changes the value of different properties at different rates. Some go up a lot, some go up a little bit. Very few go down. But the differences are amazing.
Right.
As a result, it's very interesting, and I was surprised to find this out, the people who owned property between $50,000 and $100,000, these are the most modest property owners, primarily homeowners. There are very few businesses at that end of the scale. Had an average increase in their tax bill to pay for this 3.8% increase in the tax levy. The average increase for that group of taxpayers was 13%, almost 4 times as much as the tax levy.
Sure.
At the other end of the scale, the very largest properties, businesses, industries, in this cycle of revaluation, their values didn't go up very much at all, about 20% on average. But with the revaluation, we had a much lower tax rate, so that the Home Depots and the Walmarts averaged a 24% decrease in their tax bill the same year. I don't see how anybody can accept this as a fair distribution of a tax burden when people who own the most modestly priced homes have to pay a 13% increase.
Sure.
And the largest companies, incidentally, Home Depot's profits rose 17% that year.
Right.
Received a 24% decrease. And this isn't good guys against bad guys.
No.
Home Depot's not a bad place.
Sure.
This has nothing to do with that. It's the marketplace. We have given over our taxes to the market. And markets don't care about fairness. They just have to be honest.
Right.
But they don't care about fairness. It's the market.
And I want to get to your proposal on how you'd like to see this fixed to be a more fair system. But Representative Laughlin, let me switch to you. In your district, Little Compton, Portsmouth, and Tiverton, what are people telling you about their property taxes?
Well, I can't think of anyone in my district who's enthusiastic about property taxes. We see many of the same structural mechanisms that have taken place in North Kingstown at work in my district, and we find that in the same cases that those that can least afford to pay frequently are the ones who are asked to pay more, regardless of how much more money the town actually needs at any given time. So that was one of the tremendous appeals to Harvey's proposal and Harvey's thinking on this, was a way to make this distribution of taxes more fair and to align it with the actual needs of the community. So if the community needs more money, if the community needs 3 or 4% or 5% more in tax revenue, well, then doesn't it make sense that everybody should pay 3 or 4 or 5% more in taxes, and not some folks should pay 25% more and others should pay 24% less?
But what you're talking about right now, and Dr. Waxman and I talked about this before the show, Dr. Waxman, is when the levy goes up 3 or 4% within a given year before a revaluation, that's what people are seeing now.
Absolutely.
Correct.
But under your plan, you're looking to keep this percentage of an increase the same whether there's a revaluation or not?
Essentially, the only reason for a revaluation is not to determine the value of your property, but to determine the value of the entire community, because in that way you can establish a fair tax rate. The tax rate should be applied to people who buy property for a certain price, assuming it's a price they can afford and they're willing to pay, and they should pay a tax based on that. It's a fair tax because it does encompass the entire community, but it's only applied to people whose purchases reflect their income and wealth at that point in time. After that, the fact that their property may go up in value 3 or 4 times has no effect on their relative wealth. If my property doubles in value, I haven't suddenly become twice as rich.
Right.
Unless, of course, I have to sell my home. How ironic. In order for me to afford to live in a community, I have to sell my home to pay my taxes.
Now, under your plan, you're looking at having the distribution of the tax levy spread around all taxpayers, all property taxpayers in a community. For people who are watching, what you're asking in terms of a reform doesn't necessarily mean tax relief. It just will make the process fairer in terms of spreading out that burden every year amongst all the taxpayers. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, we see the problem with property taxes in this state and every state as a problem with the budget. Those pesky unions are spending too much money. Now, maybe they are. I'm not here to defend wasteful budgets. I think we can do a lot to bring in spending. But if that's all we do, we will not solve the problem, because we have 2 problems, and no one appears interested in addressing the distribution problem. If we reduce the budget and instituted a revaluation as we do every 3 years,
Right.
even with a reduced budget, we still have these huge discrepancies in the burden. For example, in that year that I talked to you about in North Kingstown, where the $100,000 homeowners paid a 13% increase in their tax bill for the following year, and the Home Depots and Walmarts paid a 24% decrease for the same year. Under this plan, every existing property owner would pay 2.1% more, would have paid if we had had this, 2.1% more than they paid the year before. That's it, across the board. No one would get 200% increases, and some people did. And no one would get decreases. Right. Everyone pitches in, the way the Constitution tells us. The burdens of the state ought to be fairly distributed among its citizens. And I think this proposal does that.
I think the interesting thing, too, that you see is that after a revaluation, the amount of money that's collected actually goes up. But some of that money's got to go somewhere else because it didn't go to the town.
Right.
So the money that's taken from the homeowner that maybe bought that $50,000 house that's now worth $350,000, that money gets shifted to somebody who maybe has a property that's worth $1 million and only went up about 2 or 3% in value. So really the money is shifted around, and it's not going to the town in the first place. I think people wouldn't mind necessarily paying more taxes if they knew they were getting better and enhanced services for that. And I think that's part of what creates a lot of this problem. And as Harvey said, one of the interesting things you find is that you can hold spending to 0. And we've run the numbers on this. You can hold spending to 0, and you'll still see the same inequities. You'll still see the folks that can least afford to pay taxes go up dramatically after a revaluation, and those that are probably in a better position to pay will go down or remain the same.
Now, under your proposal, Dr. Waxman, you have 2 classes of property owners. Those that are current owners that have been in their house for at least a year, and the new owners.
Correct.
Explain how this proposal would impact those 2 classes.
I'd like to use the word types.
Okay.
I'm trying to change that term. Somehow I don't want to be second class or first class.
There you go.
But there are 2 types of owners. We have people who live in the community and have been living in the community, and that consists of about 90% of the population in North Kingstown. Other communities may vary. And then there's that group of people who build a new house, buy a house, They're new owners. They haven't paid taxes on that property the year before. That's a type 2 owner. Now, for type 2 owners, and they exist whether we have our current system or a new system,
Right.
we still have people who buy homes. The money that they would pay in taxes is exactly the same. It makes no difference.
As it happens right now.
As it happens right now or under the proposal we're suggesting.
Right.
It makes absolutely no difference. What we try to do is to take the rest of the people and distribute the burden evenly and fairly. So all type 1 owners, we call those existing owners, the 90% of us who don't move all the time, we revalue their property, but we don't revalue it according to the market. We revalue it indexed to the change in the tax levy. If the tax levy goes up 3%, for example, everyone's property value would go up correspondingly, say 3%. And then you would pay a tax based on that. So that if last year I paid twice as much as you did, I would pay twice as much as you did this year. And we would both go up the same percentage.
Now, how would this, if, well, we talked before, you like to say when it gets into effect.
I
I'll say
hope-
if it goes into effect.
Okay.
Then we'll talk with the representative on how that may work. How would this start? What would be the starting point for, say, you know, where I would be taxed going forward?
That's a great question. And in the ideal world, we would go back to the history of the house when you bought it and reconstruct your experience over the years. It's not going to happen.
Sure.
It so happens that under our current system, there are people that are paying too much money and others that are not paying enough. We know that. So that if we institute this proposal, it's going to have to start at that level. There's just no other way to do this.
Right.
When Prop 13 started in California back in 1978, they did make it retroactive about to 1975, about 3 years. I'm not sure that that is going to be necessary or even very advantageous. We just have to bite the bullet and say we have to start now. Sure, it's not going to be that fair to people who are paying high taxes, but if we don't do it, you're still going to be paying high taxes. We haven't fixed anything.
Right.
Only now you're just going to have to depend on a flip of the coin or a throw of the dice to see what it's going to be next year and the year after. Instead, you can be assured that your taxes now will only track the budget increases. Now that's great for planning, whether you can afford your mortgage or send your kids to school. It's great for planning for Home Depot too, that they know what their tax bill is going to be. And people, we worry so much about the businesses. Frankly, if the taxes go up 2%, most businesses would not mind it if they knew, and ultimately you know we're going to pay for it anyway because they're going to adjust their prices accordingly. That's the way business works. This can happen.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions that may come to mind for people who are watching and are tracking this proposal. If I'm a town councilman or a mayor of a community, in the back of my mind, I may think, is this going to impact the amount of money I need to run my city? Okay, that's part one. And part two, if I'm a homeowner and I'm looking at this proposal and I'm thinking, well, is it going to, you know, it may not, the increases of my taxes may not go as high as they have in the past, but I'm still going to see an increase in my tax rate more than likely, my tax bill more than likely. So what good is it to me?
Two good questions. The first question, the answer to the first question is, it has absolutely no impact on the size of the budget. That's a separate problem. The only thing we're interested in is whatever the size of the budget is, high, low, or perfect, we spread it out evenly and fairly among the citizens. As to your second question, as long as budgets go up, you're going to have to pay more. But you will never pay more as a percentage than the budget goes up.
Right.
And it will
Or
be
than
the,
anyone else,
and
in
it will
terms
be
of a
the
percentage,
same
right.
for everyone. Now that changes the whole mood in the town. People are divided. We don't even understand it. At a gut level, I think that people probably feel that they're not being treated fairly, but they don't know why. So we lash out.
Sure.
This is not a good thing for communities. We can have a much better place to live if everybody shared in this burden fairly and evenly.
Now, Representative Laughlin, you've obviously signed on to this proposal. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. In your talks with some of your constituents, how are they reacting to a plan like this?
Well, it's not something that's, as you can tell already, that's something you can explain in a
not very easy.
A 30-second front door conversation. Sure. And that was one of the reasons that we took the legislative approach that we did. The first step is to get a study commission. The study commission is going to look at the right tax proposal, among others, and examine, if there are others out there, to take a look and see exactly and fully vet them, to find out what's going to work, what's not going to work. And I'd like to actually do some of the committee hearings, the study commission hearings, on the road. I'd like to take it to an urban area. I'd like to take it to some of our suburban communities and get as much input from the citizenry as we can to refine this legislation, to make sure, A, that people understand it, and B, that it makes the most sense.
In terms of some of your colleagues that may have seen Dr. Waxman's proposal, how are they reacting to it?
Universally positively. They recognize that it's very easy to when you speak with Dr. Waxman and you go through some of his slides, to understand the fundamental unfairness of the current system. And it makes everyone kind of step back and go, whoa, because it's not something that immediately comes to mind. Immediately you think of budgets, we've got to restrain spending, that will affect taxes. But when you look at the fundamental unfairness of the way taxes are distributed, and then it's counterintuitive to think that the folks that can least afford it get the largest tax increases, and the folks that can best afford it get tax decreases. Once you point out that fundamental dichotomy, then they get it immediately, and then they're enthusiastic about it. We had a meeting with the Speaker and the Majority Leader, and we went through a fairly detailed presentation, and both of them had the same reaction. They both sat back and went, wow, this is something we really need to take a look at.
Well, that's good. Dr. Waxman, Rhode Island does have tax classification. Towns can set a commercial rate and a residential rate. How does that classification, how has it worked in terms of reevaluation? Are we still seeing the discrepancies? And two, how could your proposal impact the classification?
The classification allows communities to adjust for the differences between two major groups, commercial and residential taxpayers. So it can mitigate the discrepancy in some way. But within each group, we still have the same problem because revaluation affects different homeowners differently and different businesses differently. So within the groups, the inequities still remain. So that cannot be fixed simply by changing tax rates for commercial property and for residential property. We still have pain.
It's kind of like cough syrup. Tax classification rates, cut the cough down a little bit, maybe make you feel a little bit better, but you still have the cold.
There's still a problem.
And as far as our proposal, and it's much too detailed to get into, but it does provide a tremendous amount of flexibility for communities using the tax structure to craft the kind of community that we would like to have. A particular community may want to encourage a lot of commercial businesses to come in. There are mechanisms for adjusting rates. We may perhaps like to favor businesses that are owned by residents of Rhode Island as opposed to businesses that are owned by people who live in Europe or another state. There is a mechanism to address that also. This is a very, very finely tuned system which gives a lot of flexibility to communities to really create the kind of environment and atmosphere that we want. But whatever we do, each person in each classification will be treated equally and fairly, not because of the marketplace, but because of what the community decides is in its best interest.
How long have you been researching this, Dr. Waxman, and have you seen a similar proposal in other states?
I think it's been 400 years that I've been, no.
At least 400.
Well, you only live 390.
I was going to say, I've known him for at least 270. So that's...
Actually, I started this with my first revaluation when I moved here, and it sure got my attention. There is nothing like this. It's not particularly revolutionary. Well, it is revolutionary, but it is not that complicated. I'm not that smart. This is really pretty basic stuff.
Right.
It's just that we've gotten so used to doing something. We are so accustomed to it that we have not been able to stand back and look at the trees individually.
Mm-hmm.
We just haven't been able to see it. We've just got this big veil in front of us called ad valorem taxes that prevent us from seeing the individual people that are hurt.
Mm. Looking at the history, and we can't really do anything about the past.
Correct.
But there may be some people that are going to say, well, that's all well and good, that your proposal will make it fairer from here on in, but in 2003 in North Kingstown, Walmart still paid less. They're a big company. Why can't there be something to?
That may all come, that may work out in the process by which we craft the legislation. Mm-hmm. And people may feel that this is very important. Maybe we'll try to find a way to do that. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced one way or another. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a possibility. But we can never go back. You know, in 1920, we passed women's suffrage so that women could vote, finally. That doesn't mean we could give the vote to all those women for hundreds of years before that who couldn't vote.
Right.
Sometimes you just can't go back. The question is, what do we do about the future, about our children and their grandchildren? If we resist this because we can't go back and correct past mistakes, we just condemn the future to the same problems that we currently have.
With the short time we have left, Representative Laughlin, you talked about a study commission. There recently was a hearing on the establishment of this study commission. How do you see that playing out? Is there a good chance that we'll see a commission? And obviously, any major changes is going to take a lot longer than just the scope of that commission or the length of that commission and how long it serves.
Right. Well, I certainly can't speak for the members of the Finance Committee. I know we had a tremendously powerful hearing in which I think several of the members of the committee experienced an epiphany over the inequities that exist, that maybe had not realized that before. Mm. But the process of the study commission is going to take, you know, the better part of a year. And at that point, hopefully, we'll be able to arrive at consensus and introduce legislation. And then that legislation will be further fine-tuned and heard in public and crafted through the legislative process to hopefully affect a state law that creates the change that we need.
Well, taxes and property taxes, income taxes, always a hot-button issue. And good luck to both of you, and good luck with this process. And it's going to be a long process, but I give you credit, Dr. Waxman, for coming up with this proposal and at least trying to educate the community. And hopefully we'll get you back here to talk about the process as it goes forward. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
That'll do it for this edition of State of the State. I'm Keith Tebow. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.